What is the best Pokemon game for your first Nuzlocke? Welcome to Nuzlocke University. If you're a new player who's interested in the Nuzlocke challenge but isn't sure where to start, you are in the right place. I'm going to share with you a few recommendations as to which Pokemon game is best for your first Nuzlocke based on what kind of player you are and what you're hoping to get out of your Nuzlocke experience. Now I should clarify at the start, we're not necessarily deciding on the best game to Nuzlocke today, but specifically the best games for a first Nuzlocke. There will be a lot of overlap in those lists. After all, you wouldn't want to start with a bad Nuzlocke game. But if you're an experienced Nuzlocker and your favorite game isn't on here, that might be why. Anyways, let's get started. This video has two parts. In the first part, I'm going to tell you the secret, true best game to Nuzlocke, and in the second part, we'll go through specific recommendations for each type of player. I'll put timestamps in the description if you'd like to jump around. So, part 1. What is the true best game for your first Nuzlocke? Well, it's whatever Pokemon game is your favorite, or whichever one you know the best. This might sound like a cop-out, but I'd recommend you think of it more like a disclaimer. I don't want to suggest that anyone can't have fun Nuzlocking their favorite Pokemon game. But why is this the true answer? Well, two reasons. First, you probably have the most fun playing the game you like best. Even if that's obvious, I still think it's worth remembering, ultimately this is about having fun. But second, you're more likely to have a more successful, easier first run if you pick a game you're familiar with, because game knowledge is the most important skill in Nuzlocking. Now, you might be asking a question here, which is, why does familiarity with the game matter? I mean, I've watched a lot of Nuzlocke advice videos, including some on your channel, and everyone is always recommending that I research ahead for difficult fights on websites like Bulbapedia, Cerebi, or PokemonDB. Can't I just look up everything I need to know? To answer this, I hope you'll tolerate a little bit of a tangent here. If you get the point and want to skip this interlude, I'll leave timestamps in the video description. On screen now is a 2x2 chart or matrix called the Awareness Understanding Matrix, or sometimes the Rumsfeld Matrix because it was popularized by former US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And don't worry, I promise we'll bring this back to Pokemon right away. In fact, here we go, that's better. On one axis we have awareness, on the other understanding. And together these make up 4 squares, one for known knowns, one for known unknowns, one for unknown knowns, and one for unknown unknowns. Bit of a mouthful there. To save time, we won't talk about the top half of this chart now. We'll just discuss known unknowns and unknown unknowns. So what do these categories mean, and what do they have to do with Nuzlocking? Well, a known unknown is information that we don't know, but are aware of. In other words, it's something that we know we don't know. Because we are aware of this information, we can seek out our missing understanding through research. Let's give a Nuzlocke example. You're about to fight Winona, the 6th gym leader in Pokemon Emerald. You don't remember exactly what Pokemon she carries or what moves they have, but you remember she was a tough fight last time. You go on Bulbapedia, research her team, and prepare accordingly. In this case of a known unknown, even though you didn't have all the information immediately, you are aware of your lack of knowledge and could anticipate the need to research ahead. On the other hand, an unknown unknown is something that you don't know you don't know. In other words, it's an informational shortcoming that you're not aware of, a blind spot. This one can be a bit tricky, so let's use a couple Nuzlocke examples to explain. First, think about the Route 110 rival fight in Pokemon Emerald. This is the one that happens under Cycling Road before Mauville City. When you reach a certain point on the route, your character will stop walking, and your rival will approach from out of sight to challenge you to a relatively tough battle. If you aren't familiar with Pokemon Emerald, there's a good chance you didn't know when this rival fight was coming. It's not telegraphed like a gym battle, and so you might not have even been aware that there was anything to prepare for here in the first place. If you'd known about the rival battle ahead of time, you could have researched it, but the only way to anticipate the fight is to meticulously follow a walkthrough, or to have prior experience. Another example of this is in Pokemon Platinum. You may know that by using the dupes clause, link to more info in the description if you're not familiar with it, it's possible to virtually guarantee a Gible encounter in Wayward Cave B1F. A player who's aware of this can research which routes they need to visit, and in which order, to guarantee this encounter. But a new player might not even be aware that this is a possibility. They won't know that they don't know the proper encounter routing. As a result, they might run into Wayward Cave too early, or without repels to bypass the first level, and therefore miss out on Garchomp. If they'd known this Gible trick was possible, they could have researched the method. By the way, if you're a new player and this example is going over your head, don't worry. You just need to understand that there's an opportunity here to use your knowledge of the game to gain an advantage, but that players unfamiliar with the game might not know it exists. These unknown unknowns are what make familiarity such an important factor in choosing a first Nuzlocke game. If you pick a game you don't know well, even doing lots of research, you might be caught by surprise by something you weren't aware of and therefore couldn't prepare for. With lots and lots of research and advice from others, you might have caught those specific examples we discussed, but over the course of an entire Pokemon game, there will be unknown unknowns which slip through and put you at a disadvantage. If that sounds fun to you, if you prefer to play blind, then that's totally valid and go ahead, but we should understand that it will make your first Nuzlocke experience more difficult. Alright, part 2, specific game recommendations for each type of player. So, our first player is someone who has more fond memories of Pokemon than they do recent experience with the games. You remember playing Pokemon games on your Game Boy or DS as a kid, and maybe you've played a bit here or there in the years since, but it's been a while. You've recently come across this fun-looking Pokemon challenge called the Nuzlocke, and you think it would be fun to try it out. You want a nice, casual introduction to Nuzlocking, and a little nostalgia definitely wouldn't hurt. If this is you, then my first recommendation is Pokemon Fire Red or Leaf Green. A few years ago, I ran a Nuzlocke community survey, and one of the questions I asked was which game is best for a new player's first Nuzlocke. Fire Red and Leaf Green were the overwhelming winner, with almost half the total votes, compared to second place at 17%. So why are these games such a favorite? Well, first, they're a great starting place in terms of gameplay and mechanics. They're relatively easy, and they give the player access to lots of powerful guaranteed Pokemon, like Gyarados, Snorlax, Lapras, and more. They're mechanically straightforward. The battle system isn't as bare bones as Generation 1, we get abilities and a wider variety of moves, but it doesn't yet have the gimmicks of later generations like Z-moves or Dynamax. It also doesn't hurt that we get a bit of that classic Kanto nostalgia, with some of our favorite childhood Pokemon like Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander, plus classic gym leaders like Brock and Misty. So for this type of player, that's my top recommendation, but let's share a couple more options. If you like everything I just said about Fire Red and Leaf Green, but you feel more at home in the Hoenn region than in Kanto, Ruby and Sapphire are very similar and also a great choice. And if you're wondering why I didn't say Emerald, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Finally, if you're looking for a more modern Pokemon experience that's still forgiving and accessible, then try X or Y. These games are perhaps even easier than the Generation 3 entries, but they have lots of additional quality of life features and a much wider variety of available Pokemon, plus they're 3D if you prefer that. Now, for our second type of player and our second set of recommendations. You've got some experience with Pokemon, you still interact with the game somewhat regularly, but you're not looking for anything too punishing for your first Nuzlocke experience. You want a challenging, but not frustrating, introduction to Nuzlockes. There are quite a few Pokemon games that would work for these players, but I'll suggest two: Pokemon Emerald and Pokemon Platinum. We mentioned Ruby and Sapphire in the last section, and Emerald is a similar but harder game, with some of the gym leaders being buffed significantly. There are still enough easy or relaxed stretches in between tough gyms and rival fights that the game doesn't feel exhausting, and you have access to a good variety of powerful Pokemon. While Emerald is harder than the games in our last section, it's still very beatable for a determined new player. Platinum is a bit more difficult, with quite a few run killers even in the early game, for example this Purugly in Valley Windworks, plus seriously challenging fights against Cyrus and Champion Cynthia. In my opinion, Platinum hits a difficulty sweet spot for newer players. It requires game knowledge, good team building, planning, and an ability to make clutch decisions without feeling frustrating or unfair, or requiring you to pre-plan your fights in a calculator. And finally, our last type of player. You're a Pokemon veteran, you have experience with competitive battling or challenge runs, and you're looking for something that will really test out your battle and team building skills. For you, I recommend Black and White 2, or Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. In my opinion, and I think it's pretty generally accepted, these are the toughest mainline Pokemon games. The Gen 5 games are full of tough gym leader and Team Plasma fights, and the limited Pokédex means you lose access to a lot of powerful Pokemon that you might rely on in other games. Of course, that's especially true in Black and White 1. Black and White 2 even have a challenge mode to unlock for an even tougher run. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are probably the hardest mainline games of all, due mostly to how punishing some of those totem and boss fights can be. Even some of the regular route trainers have competitive EVs and IVs, and of course there's Ultra Necrozma. Finally, if all that's not enough for you, I'll add one last bonus recommendation: Pokemon Renegade Platinum. While I generally don't recommend enhanced difficulty hacks for new Nuzlockers, if you've gotten into Nuzlocking by watching YouTubers and streamers play games like Emerald Kaizo or Run and Bun, and you're looking for an introduction that's a bit closer to that sort of experience, then Renegade Platinum is great. It's far more challenging than any other game on this list, but it still gives you access to tons of incredible tools and Pokemon, while not being so difficult that you'll have to spend hours in the calculator prepping every fight. On top of that, it's just an amazing, fun, well-made ROM hack. Renegade Platinum is the gateway between the mainline games and truly high difficulty Nuzlocking, so if that's the experience you're looking for, then start here, but only if you're brave. So, those are my recommendations for new Nuzlockers. Thanks for watching, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and leave your recommendations in the comments. If you're looking for more Nuzlocke content, check out my website, Nuzlocke University. Thanks again, and happy Nuzlocking.